Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you really enjoyed the last few episodes that we did. Like I said, the BTS episode was something that had been in the works for over a year. Liana pitched me the idea, I think last February or March, so it was very exciting to finally see it come together and just in time for BTS's comeback. And I hope you really enjoyed the hot take on Project Hail Mary. It was a lot of fun to go to the theater and then kind of just talk about the film. And I didn't say it in the episode, but that was kind of what sparked this whole podcast when I did what's the film? The very first film I did, uh Killers of the Flower Moon, I went and saw in theaters and it just made me have so many thoughts and reactions to it that I remember writing the whole essay on my way home. And I was like, you know what? I want to do a movie podcast. So I decided I'm going to go back to the roots a little bit. Not every episode is going to be a hot take on a new movie release, but I think it'll be fun maybe once a month to go, maybe not always to the theater. I think sometimes it'll be a streaming platform as well, but to review a new movie that has just dropped and like give you my hot take on it, see what comes up just on a first watch. So I hope that's fun for you guys. And if there's anything you want to see coming in the future, you can always DM me on Instagram at Real Thesis Pod. That is REAL. And our email address is realthesispod@gmail.com. So feel free to reach out and let us know if there's any movies that you want me to cover. The more headway, the better. I know I'm probably going to go see Dune, and I haven't read any of the books. I tried reading the first book, but at the very least, I should go watch the two movies that have been out. So give me a heads up if there's anything you want me to see, and I will prepare for it. But if you are new here, welcome to the Real Thesis Podcast. Welcome in. I am your host, Shalini, and this is a space where I love to analyze films, and I specifically like to look at what the director, what the screenwriters are attempting to convey with the story, and what the story is really about. What is the thesis of the story? What is the heart of the story that we're trying to convey? This episode was actually a very last-minute change. I've sort of been going down a deep dive on just this concept of passing. It's come up because of Sinners, and I watched this PBS Origins YouTube video on it, and it kind of just initiated this deep dive. And then I went to a friend's house, and they happened to have the book Passing by Nella Larsen, so I borrowed it, and I've been just reading it, unable to put it down, actually, and so much so that I was actually procrastinating on watching this week's video because I was so engrossed in the book, and I was about to put it down when I realized that I was only 5 pages from the ending. So I decided to pivot. I decided to finish the book, watch the movie adaptation, and cover this because it was just fresh in my memory. So today we are covering both the book and the film Passing. The film came out in 2021, and it stars Tessa Thompson, Ruth Negga, Andre Holland, Bill Camp, and Alexander Skarsgård, and it is directed by Rebecca Hall. She is a very well-known actress, but this is her directorial debut, and she does have some kinship to the story. It's a story that holds close to her heart, and I'm going to link a little video below because she can explain that far better than I can. And the film had very critical reviews. It was nominated for a lot of stuff, and Ruth Negga was actually nominated for a BAFTA, a Screen Actors Guild Award, and a Golden Globe for her performance in this film. I am going to go over the plot of the film, but I will be going over the plot of the book a little bit later because, in my opinion, I think it diverges a little bit. The film starts with Irene, played by Tessa Thompson, who is shopping in New York on an extremely hot day. She decides to go to the Drayton Hotel to cool off, and she runs into an old friend, Claire Kendry. Claire is a Black person who she grew up with, who is passing as white. So they end up going to her suite to talk a bit more in depth about this and talk more openly. And we find out that basically after, they kind of grew up together. They weren't the best of friends. They were in the same circles. But after Claire's father died, Claire went off to live with her white aunts, and she eventually married and has been passing as a white woman ever since. Her husband comes home, and he has a really derogatory nickname for Claire. I'm not going to say it, but it is the first 3 letters of the N-word. He explains that he has this nickname because Claire was very fair when they got married, but since then she's been getting darker and darker. And she jokes and she's like, well, what does it matter now if I have any drop of, Black in me? And he's like, oh, it matters because I cannot have that in my family. Basically, he is very racist, and it's upsetting because Irene, who can pass as a white person, she's sitting there, and Irene and Claire are both black, passing as white women in this instance, and she's in a very uncomfortable position in which she's meeting Claire's husband, John Bellew, played by Alexander Skarsgård, and it's just a very terrible moment. But Irene goes back to her life, and we kind of see a bit of her life. She has two sons. She's married to a doctor. They have a very good relationship, but it does have a little bit of tension in it. And moreover, her husband is just he's not very happy being a doctor. And, he is also just kind of upset about what's happening in the United States, and he really wants to move to Brazil. We also find out that Irene is in charge of the Black Welfare League. She's running it. She kind of is the head committee for that. Claire writes Irene a letter, and Irene just refuses to write back because she's so upset that Claire put her in a position of having to, have tea with this blaring racist person. But nevertheless, Claire stops by her house and the two make up. And Claire attends the Black Welfare League dance along with Irene and Brian. And she has a great time. And at the dance, Irene confesses to her good friend Hugh, a white man played by Bill Camp, that Claire is actually black, passing as white. After that, Claire becomes a fixture in Irene's life. She's kind of always hanging around. If Irene is busy, she plays with the kids, or she, just hangs out with Zulina, who is Irene's maid. And Zulina is played by Ashley Jenkins. And at the same time, Irene and Brian's marriage is starting to get a little bit more tense. He tries to educate his sons on the horrors that are happening to Black people, mostly in the South, and Irene just will not have it. And for a variety of reasons, like their marriage is just sort of feeling a bit tense. And Irene confesses to Claire that being a wife and being mother is incredibly important to her, and she takes it very seriously. And Claire says, I don't feel the same way. I don't feel the same sense of duty. And, I will throw anyone over and do anything to get what I want. And then she starts to cry, which confuses Irene. But Claire just starts to continue to kind of come into Irene's life very uninvited. She's almost there all the time. She goes out to parties alone with Brian. And after a while, Irene suspects that Claire and Brian are having an affair. And this rocks her world because the security of her family, the stability of her husband's job, this, them being a safe, secure, middle-class family is incredibly important to her. And she is so upset that Claire has inserted herself and that she's a threat. One day, Irene is out shopping and she runs into John Bellew, who is surprised to see her, and he goes to shake her hand before realizing that she is with another Black woman. And he realizes that Irene is Black herself. And Irene just kind of rushes away without saying anything. And she goes home and tries to warn Claire, but Claire's not home and she kind of drops the attempt to warn her. Later, Irene, Claire, and Brian all go to a party. And as they're climbing the stairs, Irene asks Claire, "What would you do if your husband found out you were Black?" And Claire says, "Well, I would just come and live in Harlem with you." They're at the party. Irene is not having very much of a good time. She's distracted. She opens a window to smoke. And John Bellew crashes the party and accosts Claire. And he says, "You lied to me that you're Black." And Irene he kind of lunges at Claire, and Irene goes to sort of stand between them or protect Claire. And in doing so, she accidentally knocks Claire out of the open window, and Claire falls to her death and dies. And the film ends with Brian comforting Irene. Before we go any further, I wanted to give a bit of a background on Nella Larsen because I think she has a very interesting background. She was born in the Chicago area to a Danish mother and a West Indian and Danish father who disappeared from her life when she was 2. Her mother married another Danish person, and they lived in a very immigrant/predominantly white neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago. And it was just very interesting because she was the only person of color in her family. They ended up having another daughter together, and she was the only person of color. And her mom encouraged her to attend Fisk University in Nashville. And she was there for about a year. She moved to Denmark for about a year. She then moved to New York and became a nurse. And she eventually married the physicist Dr. Elmer Isles, who is actually the second African American to have a PhD in physics. And she also is the first African American to graduate from the New York Public Library program. And with the library, she did a lot of work in integrating the staff, but then also bringing a lot of talks and speakers. And her connections to the library, her having connection to this literary world, her being in a middle class society, her husband's work, it all put her in the position to basically be in the heart of the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance took place between around 1918, so the end of World War I, and mid 1930s, so kind of right when the Depression was taking hold. And it was a time of it happened all over the country, but the heart of it was in Harlem, New York, where there was basically just this very affluent, rich, culturally rich, intelligent, traveled like Black society. And it was such a time of burgeoning literature and music and fashion and intellectual thought and essays. And I mention all of this because Nella Larsen was like physically in the heart of it. She was connected to and friends with a lot of these people. And passing is sort of set very squarely within this world. And at the same time, the book Passing has become one of the really important pieces of the landmark Renaissance, probably because it just shows this world and its richness and its affluence. So I mention all of this just to give you a background on Nella Larsen and to tell you a little bit more about the book. But let's dive into the film. I didn't tell you how I felt about it because honestly, I didn't like the film. And I don't think it was probably a bad idea. Like I literally closed the book and then turned on the film, and that was probably a bad idea. I should have like let it breathe a bit. I loved the book. I thought her writing was so beautiful. She is able to express very complex emotions in a way that is just so simple, and the text is so rich. And I found the film to be very diminutive. It didn't capture enough for me. There was a moment that I was even hesitating covering it because I was like, I don't know if anybody's heard about this film or would even know what this film is. I mean, I had known about it, but I didn't know much about it. And then when I was doing my research, that's when I found out that it was nominated for so many awards. Ruth Negga was nominated for so many things for it. And I was like, oh, it was a big deal. Like there's a lot of good reviews of it. People absolutely loved it. I think it's just because I read it back to back that it just didn't really resonate with me. And I think the movie was missing a lot of points that you could have gotten from the book. So let's start the analysis with what passing is. Passing is when a person of one ethnicity basically lives their life, appears, presents like another. Historically, that was often a Black person presenting as a white person, but there are instances in which people have done it cross-culturally. Asians have passed for white people have passed for Native American. I don't know of any instances of a white person passing for a Black person, but obviously the most common is a Black person passing for a white person. And the reason you do this is obviously this was all happening at a time of huge racism and just systemic oppression against people of color. And so if you could pass as a white person, you would do it to basically give yourself a better chance to have more opportunities, to basically be able to do more and live more freely without this oppression. That said, when somebody passed, it was a very hard decision, or it was a very heavy decision, because it wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to walk out the house and walk into a white store. It was like a lot of times people renounced their family. They completely left the Black community. They left their family, they left their friends, like they shed their entire background to go live their life as a white person. There's a very sad account when I was reading of a man who passed his own mom on the street, and he couldn't even acknowledge her because he was passing as a white man and his mom was very apparently Black. And at the time, like he would have given himself away, or would have been suspicious, or just been so weird if he talked to his own mother. So like, it's a very heavy thing that people did. And obviously there's a whole spectrum of it. There's probably more casual instances of it. But in general, historically, the idea of passing was a very distinct, hard, impactful decision that people made. And I really want to drive home this fact because I think that it was a hard thing that people decided to do, but despite how hard it was still a decision that people undertook because the oppression against people of color was so severe that it was easier to pass. It was easier to shed your entire life, to disown your entire community, to not speak to your family or to distance yourself from them. in order to have this security that being white, gave you. And it's hard to look at it. It's hard to go back and really understand just how serious of a concept this was. And we do see it a little bit in the movie Sinners. I think her name is Mary. Her character, she passes, and they don't get into it a lot, but like it's a serious decision. And I guess I'm just trying to drive home this fact because it's a sad decision that people undertake. And in our book, Claire decides to pass, and it was sort of an easy decision for her because her one connection to the Black community, which was her father, died, and she was already living with white people. They were very racist. They forbade her from telling anybody that she was white. So it was a very easy transition to her to be white. Irene's character, on the other hand, has a lot of affinity and a lot of love and pride in her Black community and in her Black heritage that she, even though she can pass, she has no interest in passing. And it just shows you like both sides of the scale and what passing is. In the book, Larsen writes about it in a very matter-of-fact way because she is, she's living in the 1920s. The book comes out in 1929. And it's a very matter of fact. Like, you don't know any different. It's just her world. She sets it very squarely. And I think the film adopts her very matter of fact perspective on it. But in doing so, it doesn't quite grasp the gravity of passing. And I think that the film needed to do a bit more to translate this concept into modern audiences. For instance, the whole movie is set with an introduction to two women that are walking. They use a racial slur. And they talk about how the only Black person their child knows is like someone who works at the house or like a housekeeper. And it does set us squarely within this time. It does give us this idea that there is racial tension. And then a lot is translated through Tessa Thompson's acting. She, if you know her, you know that she has some Black heritage and stuff. But in the film, it's all black and white. So I guess, her race is much more ambiguous in the film. And she is always putting her head down. She's shopping in a white store. She goes to this white hotel and she's very nervous. And basically, it's through her acting that we're trying to convey that she is a Black woman, is nervous in this white setting. And she does a really great job of it. Like, I'm not saying she doesn't, but I also don't think it was enough. Like, her nervousness in a white setting, I think there were some missed opportunities in which you could have driven home the historical context of the film. And, for instance, when Irene leaves the store that she's shopping at, she has this horrified look on her face and she's kind of staring at something before we see what she's staring at. And I thought she was staring at something violent happening, but it turns out she's staring at a man passed out on the street and everyone's kind of frantically trying to make sure he's okay because it's so hot outside. So she's very upset by this and she hails a taxi and the taxi takes, the taxi's like, oh, I'll take you to the Drayton Hotel for a drink. And she's like, okay, let's go. In the movie, I understand that you needed this scene because she's shopping in New York where she lives. So you kind of needed a plot point to be like, okay, why wouldn't she just go home? Like, if it's a really hot day, why is she trying to run errands? Like, why doesn't she just go back uptown? But in the book, she's not at home. She's in Chicago and she's trying to get a gift for her son. And so she's not at home. So she doesn't have that option. So I get it. It was a plot point. But like, to me, I think that could have been a missed opportunity to show a bit of a world and to show what the racial interactions were in a place like New York. I don't know what it was like in New York in the 1920s. Like, was the racism extremely overt? Did people avoid certain areas? Like, obviously there was neighborhoods that were predominantly Black, but like, if people wanted to go downtown, can they just walk around freely? Are they not allowed into places? Like, it sounds silly to say, but I don't know the details of it. And I would have loved to see it on screen. I remember, this is so embarrassing to admit, but I was reading the book and they talk about how their school was integrated because in the book, there's a character, a classmate, Gertrude, who's Black and marries a white man, but she can pass as well. And I remember putting the book down and my mind was blown that they had integrated schools in 1929. And I am so embarrassed because once I realized it, it's one of those things that it's obvious. It's like a glass shattering moment. And I was like, oh yeah, of course they would have. But like, I'm from the South. All of my education, I was educated in the South. And on top of that, all of my education as it pertains to race was focused on the South. Like it was about racial tensions. It was about, major acts that were happening. It was about how desegregated schools were. And when I think about school segregation, like even after schools were trying to be integrated, like there's still zoning. Like it's all about the desegregation that had never occurred to me in the 1920s that you can have an integrated school. And that was normal. And I remember putting the book down for like a full 5 minutes and sitting there and being like, how have I not figured this out? And I felt so dumb. I can't believe this very common piece of knowledge eluded me for so long. I'm so embarrassed to say that. That is such a big tangent. Let's get back to the film. So let's talk about Claire and why she passes. For her, it was very much out of necessity. She was being treated like a servant. She describes her aunts as, like, they took her in because it was their Christian duty, but they punished her because she was Black. And also because she was Black, they forced her to work. They treated her really horribly. They weren't kind to her. And so to her, passing was a way to escape a really bad situation. She also was the daughter of a janitor. So growing up, her father, they're kind of in this like middle class group of people. Her father had gone to school with all the other dads, but he was a janitor. They didn't have as much money. Claire mentioned that she was always wanting what the other girls had. So she, found a way to get it. She would like save up scraps. She worked as a seamstress to try and save up money herself. Her father was a drunk, and he basically, died in a bar fight. And it basically really establishes this fact that Claire, it was such an obvious choice for her. Like she didn't have this safety and this security and this home life that she could rely on. Whereas Irene's father, you get the sense like Irene has more of a stronger family unit. Her parents are more middle class, they're more stable. She herself goes to college, I think, and she travels abroad, and she's married to a doctor. Like she has a very stable background and she continues to have a stable life, and she has created a stable family for herself. And Claire does not have that. And I think it's a very, I guess my point is like, for Irene, she has the ability to choose not to pass because she has a lot of security around her, and Claire doesn't have that security. Claire passes in order to just basically have money and security, and she does. She gets everything. She has everything that she wants, but the one thing she cannot get from money is family and community. And that's why she's so drawn to wanting to come back. And I think she had the notion before even meeting Irene, because she mentions that she wanted to go see Irene's father. And Irene's father was kind of like the person who checked on her even after her father died. So she had a bit of a connection with him. So she mentions wanting to go see him. And I think Irene is like the instigator to make her truly want to come back. But Claire had this notion because she got everything she wanted. She, was fabulous and glorious and beautiful and everything. But like, she's so lonely in her life. Like there was nobody that she can connect with. And her husband is very racist. And so she can't connect with him in a lot of ways. And she has a daughter, and her daughter goes to school abroad, and she doesn't seem to have much of a motherly instinct or much connection to her daughter in the way that Irene does. So she's very lonely in her life. I'll also mention that Larsen never talks about the exact genetic makeup of either Claire or Irene. So we don't know, we don't know if Claire is half Black or 1/4 Black or 1/8. And it doesn't matter. Like she doesn't mention it because it doesn't matter. Because the only thing that matters is that both women can pass for white, and that both women have African American blood. So at the time, they are considered Black. And that's all that matters. And it's such a dichotomy because that's what it was. It's, yes, I can appear white, but at the end of the day, I have Black heritage or African American heritage. So she doesn't tell us. We don't know the exact genetic makeup, and it's not relevant to the story. Going back to Claire, though, Claire has this ability to connect with a lot of people. And I think it's because she herself, she's this very now high class, beautiful, glamorous woman, but because of her background, it's given her the ability to connect at all levels. And when Irene's working, she's sometimes just hanging out with Zulina, the maid, and she's able to connect with Zulina because she herself had to work like a servant in her family's household, in her aunt's household. And throughout the book, like Claire mentions again, I said this, but Claire mentions that her aunts made her work because it was like a Black thing to do. And that's a theme that comes up a lot in the novel, that there's this concept of a Black person working harder or having to work a lot. There's a joke that Brian makes at the end. He's like, oh, have you ever, gone up to the 6th floor by Black power? And he means like, have you walked up 6 flights of stairs? Because people weren't always allowed to use the elevators. But the film actually touches on this idea because there's several times that you see Zelina, who is a darker skinned woman, and she's working in the kitchen, she's making something, and the next shot will be Irene's character like napping or sleeping in a chair. And it does give you this like notion, or it kind of indicated to me like there is something, there is this idea that Irene is somewhat isolated from these experiences. Not all of them, obviously, because she's Black. She's excluded from a lot of things. She's subject to racism, but she also gets to be protected from some things because of her social status, because of her family, because of her husband's job, but also maybe at times because she's light-skinned. And the film just like hints at this a little bit. And I think it's a very interesting theme to bring up because it is something that's brought up time and time again in the novel. So let's talk about Irene. In the book, she's described as like, she can look like she's Spanish, Italian, Mexican, but she is never assumed to be Black when she's alone. And so I thought Tessa Thompson was a really good acting. I think especially when you put her in the black and white coloring of the film, that her race can be a lot more ambiguous. But it's incredibly important because like Irene can pass, but the rest of her family can't. Her husband and her boys are very distinctly Black. And it's also, a big deal that she chooses not to pass, but she passes when it's convenient for her. She passes to get tickets. She passes to just run into a store. Like she passes to go to a hotel. Like she's able to slip this identity on and off in a way that a lot of other people, the way her husband can't, the way her sons can't, the way her friend Felice can't, like the way Zelina can't, like she is able to slip in and out of it and basically shed the identity whenever she wants. And, at the same time, like even though she could pass, she chooses not to pass in her day-to-day life because Irene has this intense loyalty to her race. She's extremely protective of it. She's very proud of it. She runs the Black Welfare League and, she's very embedded in her community. She even says at one point, like, we look down on people who pass, but at the same time, we almost like admire it and we do understand why people get it. And moreover, we help protect the people who are passing. We're not acknowledging them on the streets and stuff like that. So it's a complex relationship, but she has loyalty at the end of the day to her race, first and foremost. And I mentioned this, but she wants to out Claire to John Bellew at some point. But when the opportunity arises, she clams up and it's instinctual. She doesn't think, her mind just shuts up and she ignores him. And it just goes to show that her loyalty to race comes before anything else. And she hates Claire at this point. But she still chooses to protect her because of her race over anything else. Okay, let's get into the romantic desire aspect of the book. I read this entire book, and I did not pick up on the fact that there could be something between Irene and Claire. I think I was so interested in the writing that I actually wasn't looking at the words. But, someone else was reading it. I recommended it to someone else and they're like, oh yeah, it's so obvious. And then when I went back to look, I was like, oh yeah, that was obvious. So in the film, it's very much portrayed. I think Ruth Negga, like she actually has far less screen time, I think, kind of than Irene. But her acting is just so profound. And she really looks at Irene's character with this like ambiguous longing. And I think it's open for interpretation because it can be like, I want you. But it could also be like, I want your life. Like, I want what you have. And she has such like deep longing when she looks at Irene. And Irene, I don't think really looks at her in the same way. Like there are scenes that she does look at her or she's intrigued by her, but there's always more of a tint of jealousy. But we do see that Claire takes up a lot of Irene's mind. In the book, I think it's much more even. Claire just uses like very longing language and desirable language towards Irene. And Irene's manifestation of this desire is different. Like she'll be so angry at Claire, and then Claire will say something or cry, and she is just filled with compassion, and she kind of just forgets everything. So it's different ways that their feelings are portrayed towards each other, but I do think that you can interpret both. And in the movie, like it's in the letter is the same as in the book, but like in the movie, Brian is reading the letter that Claire wrote, and he's like, "I long for you, like I long to be with you." And Irina's like, "Stop making fun of Claire." And he's like, "I'm literally reading what's in the letter." And it does say things like that. It's like, I'm so lonely without you, like so lonely. I long to be with you. You've sparked this wild desire. And I don't know how I didn't see it when I read it. I think I was just caught up in the writing, but yeah, it can definitely be read as romantic. And so I do want to talk about the fact that passing can be sexual passing, passing as we know it, as it's in the book, it's it's racially, it's mostly a Black person in a white community, but the entire plot of the novel, besides the introduction, takes place within the Black community. And so we have a Black person integrating with the Black community. There is no passing. And to be honest, I'm not entirely clear if the Black community knows that Claire is Black or if they figure it out. I don't know. That's not clear because you're so in Irene's head all the time. But I think my point is that, like, we're not actually seeing Claire as a Black person in a white world. We're seeing Claire at home with her community. So it makes me think that there can be a dual meaning of passing. And I think that dual meaning could be sexual. And of course, the book is written in 1929. Like, someone like Nella Larsen is probably not going to write this any more explicitly. Like, this might be as explicit as it gets. But yeah, I think it can be read into it that it's sexual passing as well. And I do want to mention that in the movie, they kind of hint at Hugh Wentworth, Irene's friend. They hint that he's passing as a straight man. He has a wife, but they're hinting that he passes. And, that's an interpretation, that's a decision Hall made. And a lot of people do read the book and think that Hugh Wentworth is gay. He is based on he's based on Carl Van Vechten, who was one of Nella Larsen's really good friends. And Carl was married to women, but he also had open relations with men. So, he was either bi or gay. But either way, like I guess it was just more very commonly known that he was gay. And Hugh's character is based a lot on Carl. But, when I was reading the book, I really couldn't find the evidence that Hugh is gay. And maybe I just missed it again. But no, I couldn't find the evidence. And so I personally don't think you can go as far and say as like, oh, the inspiration is gay, so the character is. So I wouldn't say Hugh's character is gay, but he is kind of, it's hinted at, or it's, touched on in the movie a little bit, but I think there's interpretation hands down that there is a romantic or a desire or, some kind of thing that's going on between Irene and Claire. At the Black welfare dance, there's this moment where Claire is just standing and kind of just like bobbing to the music. And it's a beautiful moment when Irene takes her hand. And it's a moment in the movie that it really makes you feel like it's kind of the only time that you see Irene express this kind of desire towards Claire. And I thought it was very beautiful. And then a man walks up and Claire immediately drops her hand. And it's a really beautiful moment. I think it could have been a bit more. But at the end, when John Bellew crashes the party, there's another really beautiful moment between the two characters where Irene just looks at Claire and she just looks at her like so sadly and so longingly, like what they have is over. And Claire just looks at her with like so much love. And I thought it was such beautiful acting on both their parts. And like I said, it's not explicitly put in the movie. It's not explicitly in the book, but I think in both you can easily interpret that there was a romantic love between them as well. I'm going to go over the plot of the book a little bit because it does differ a bit from the movie. So they initially meet in Chicago, and she's out shopping. She goes to the hotel because it's hot. That's where she meets Claire, and then Claire's like, come over for tea tomorrow, and Irene doesn't want to, and she really tries to avoid it, but then she ends up going, and then she's invited. It's like kind of a get together with her and another classmate of theirs. And she, John comes home, and without really meaning to, she meets John and finds out that he's like a blaring racist. And she's stuck at tea with this guy who hates Black people. And he's sitting with 3 women who are Black, passing as white in this instance. So it's an incredibly uncomfortable position. She leaves Chicago and she's like, I never want to talk to Claire again. And then Claire drops into New York because of her husband's business. And, they basically make up. Claire, becomes more of a fixture in her life. And Claire is just sort of encroaching in on Irene's life more and more. But like Irene just never has the ability to say something or to stop Claire. Like she sort of sees the way everybody is taken by Claire, but she herself seems to be taken by Claire a bit. And like there's a lot of these women are very clearly foils of each other. Like Irene is so desperate for her stability and security of her family. And she tries to, she doesn't want her husband to tell her kids about lynchings or these racist attacks that are happening in the South or even just, around the US. And somebody, she doesn't want him to educate her kids. She wants to protect their innocence. But like someone at school called her kid the N-word, and her husband is like, you're trying to protect them, but you can't. But like, Irene has this frantic hold over controlling her husband and her kids and manipulating everything to just keep things as they are and protect them. And Claire is like very reckless. She doesn't seem to care. Like she loves her daughter, but you don't get the sense that she has this sense of duty in motherhood as Claire does. She hints at like hating John and just like feeling like John's holding her back. Like she's just so free and reckless and unencumbered. And at one point, she does confess to Irene. She's like, I said this, but it is same in the book where she was like, I would do anything. I would throw anyone over. I'm not safe. Like she's almost confessing to Irene that I will throw you over if it means that I can, get what I want. And they actually do have this scene where it's a moment in which Irene has this realization that she thinks Brian and Claire are having an affair, and it's never confirmed in the book. And it's not really confirmed in the movie either. And I think you can look at what Claire is saying, like, I will do anything to get what I want. You can kind of see that as a bit of a confession to the affair. But Irene is, she's so upset with it because this affair, like, potentially interrupts this beautiful home life that she has, and she doesn't want it to affect her at all. At the same time, like before Claire, Brian has this restlessness. He like wants to leave the US. He's not happy. And then after Claire, she senses this restlessness is done or calmed down. So on one hand, like Brian seems a bit more content staying in America, but it's because of Claire, and that's a threat to her. There's a scene where her and Brian host a tea party for Hugh. And in the book, she sees Hugh watching Claire and Brian basically flirt. And she is so annoyed because she doesn't want Hugh to catch on that there might be something between Brian and Claire, because she wants the appearance of her family. Like she doesn't want anybody to know. And she wants her family and the appearance of her family to remain as is. It's kind of played out differently in the movie. In the movie, she's upset with watching Brian and Claire talk, and she knocks a teapot over, and Hugh kind of comes to the rescue and helps her clean it up. But then also she makes a joke about it, why the teapot was ugly, and Hugh is just like, well done. And he's kind of congratulating her on breaking an ugly teapot, but also congratulating her on like, navigating a socially awkward moment. So he's a very endearing friend in the movie. And I do really love that moment between them. But in the book is much more played up as like, Irene has this absolute fear that something is going to disrupt her life with her husband and her kids. And she is completely moved to the point of telling John Bellew that Claire is Black. And that's why it's surprising, because literally the next day or whatever, she runs into him and she has this opportunity and she can't say it. She can't say anything. He extends his hand to shake her hand. She doesn't take it. She just stares at him. And then he sees Felice, who's clearly Black. And that's when he puts it together that she's Black. And she just walks away and ignores him. And she's just like, why did I ignore him? Like I could have told him. And she thinks about it, and she doesn't warn Claire, and she doesn't even tell Brian what happened. And she finally asks Claire, she's like, Claire, what would you do if John found out? And she's like, have you thought about it? And Claire answers, yes. And she does it in such a sad, heavy way that you get the impression that Claire might actually do something very drastic and something, um, I don't know, spontaneous if John ever found out. But then Irene pushes and she's like, well, what would you do? And Claire's like, I would just move here to Harlem with you. And and it's that moment that Irene realizes this is just before they go to the party. And that's that moment that Irene realizes, like, oh, heck no. Like, this woman cannot be free of her husband, because if she is free of her husband, she is going to come steal my life. So it was instinct. Her instinct to not say anything to John was to protect Claire as a Black woman, to protect her race, defend her race. But her instinct not to say anything to Brian or Claire was an instinct to protect her marriage, to basically not interrupt it, to make sure Claire doesn't get found out. And in the book, Claire is leaving. She's not permanently living in New York. She's going to leave in March, and this is like after New Year's. So the clock is just ticking down. And she's like, I'm just trying to get to March when this woman will leave my life. So it's not a permanent problem. And then they go to the party, and John accosts Claire, and Felice steps in the way. So he never actually physically gets up on Claire, because Felice stops him, and Felice is hosting the party, and she's like, careful, you're the only white man here. And Claire smiles. Like, Claire's kind of in control of the situation. She's completely unbothered by what's happening. She's doesn't seem to care that her life is falling apart, and she smiles. And it's that smile that makes Irene rush at her and grab her arm. And in doing that, Claire falls out the window. And, I don't think Irene pushed her, but I think Irene jolted her enough that she fell out. And there's things that Irene says, and I'll read it. It says, Irene wasn't sorry. She was amazed, incredulous almost. She repeats, it was an accident. It was, with emphasis on was. And what if Claire was not dead? She felt nauseated as much at the idea of a glorious mutilated body as from fear. And it's that smile. It's that smile that Claire's like, well, F it. Like, I'm okay if my life blows apart, because this life here that I have found in Harlem is pretty nice. And Claire is completely fine with the chaos that she has created and the danger that she's in, because she is like, I like this life. And Irene is like, no, like, you cannot have my life. So I think that there's a lot of hints that Irene pushes her, and everybody rushes down to see if she's died. And at one point in his shock, Brian is like, no, there's no way she could have like fainted and fallen. Because some people are like, oh, she just fainted and fell out the window. And Brian is like, no, there's no way. That's impossible. And I think he could see that from where she was, it was just too far of a distance to just faint and fall and cover that distance. But when the police come, he tells the police that he saw John push his wife. And so when the police ask Irene, she's like, no, that didn't happen. And so the police call it death by misadventure. I think Brian saw what Irene did. And like, once he processed it, I think he wanted to protect her. So he was throwing John Bellew under the bus. But at the end of the day, like, Irene was just like, no, it wasn't him either. And in the movie, he kind of gives Irene this knowing look. But yeah, it's more, in the movie, she kind of is moving to protect her, and Hall, really leans into this idea that Irene is protective of her race. But in the book, I think it's more ambiguous, but I also think you can interpret it as like this, she's pushed to the edge, and so she pushes Claire to the edge. Sorry. But let's pivot back to the film and talk about a bit with, what worked in the film. The entire film is black and white, and this has been done, but there's obviously not a lot of films that do it, and it's definitely a hard undertaking because you don't always know how a color is going to come out, what kind of shade it's going to be, depending on the lighting, depending on the color. So it was a big undertaking, and the color is very intentional in the film. They're wearing a lot of white. It's a beautiful white, hotel when they're at the Drayton, both posing as white women. The women are often contrasted with each other. Claire has white hair. Uh, Irene has dark hair, and sometimes they're like, it's a beautiful contrast because Claire will be, lighter hair in a darker outfit, and Irene will be darker hair in a lighter outfit. And so it's beautifully balanced. The scenes often it fades out to white, and it sometimes fades out to snow, which is a bit of foreshadowing. And as Claire becomes more and more of a presence in Irene's life, the colors become darker. What Irene is wearing is just darker. There's more shadow. And then, kind of at the climax when Irene just feels at her pushed to the edge, everything is quite dark. And so it was very beautifully shot, and I think very intentionally shot. Hall is very intentional with the music, and she uses the music to really convey how Irene's thoughts are just kind of preoccupied by Claire and running away with Claire and stuff. And the music also really captures the vitality and the liveliness and just the beauty of the music at this time, even though it's like an original composition by Devonte Hines / Blood Orange. And I will say that the acting is really done by really everybody, but especially by Tessa Thompson and Ruth Negga. They embody their characters really well. They embody both the freeness and the attractiveness. Ruth Negga embodies that in Claire, and Tessa Thompson really embodies just the tension and the stress that Irene feels. And Claire's voice in the book is described as like raspy, and I couldn't picture it until I heard Ruth Negga speak it, and I was like, oh, that's it, yeah.
Called me that for a long time. Don't you know me? Not really, really.
And she has a bit of a Southern accent, and it makes sense because her ancestors could have been from the South, who they migrated with the Great Migration. And something else that I loved is that Claire speaks much more conversationally, much more casually, and Irene speaks much more formally. And I think that really indicates their not even their current social background, because Claire is probably a higher class than Irene, but their backgrounds. Like Claire, is janitor's daughter, and, she didn't go to college, whereas I think Irene did and has a more established middle-class background. So I thought it was really interesting that the way they speak is very different, and I like that it helped distinguish their backgrounds. Right after Claire falls, there's a beautiful shot of Irene standing in front of the window with her arm out like this, and it's blocked by the crowd of people. And to me, it was an affirming shot. At first, I was annoyed that her arm was blocked, but it was an affirming shot that, like, her loyalty to race was the thing that drove her to instinct at the end of the day. And everybody rushes down, and Irene is left still standing with her arm out. And then she slowly turns and faces the window, and she puts her arms behind her back and kind of just like takes a finger. And it was such a good moment because it gives you this sense of like control. Like it makes you think of a mastermind, but yet there is some anxiousness and tension in her hands. And it was a really cool moment. And it was a moment that I was like, oh, this is so creepy. And, it was very well done. I mentioned this earlier, but after Claire falls, Brian is comforting Irene, who's in shock. And the policeman ask her, oh, did you see John push her? And Brian kind of gives Irene a knowing look, like he may have seen what happened, or he may suspect, but there is no world in which he's going to turn his wife over. And the whole movie is punctuated by the music, especially as Claire becomes more present in Irene's mind, and then after she's gone, it's just silent, and you're just in this quiet snowstorm. And it was beautiful in that regard. All this to say, I think the film could have been better. The film, when I was watching it, it made me think of Get Out, because I think that Jordan Peele does a very good job of translating how scary it is to be a Black man in this affluent, white, racist community. And even before any of the actual horror of Get Out happens, you're really nervous for Daniel Kaluuya's character. Everything is perfectly fine, and yet something is off. And everybody is saying the right things, or nothing is going against him, but you can feel something is off. I'm not saying that this needed to be a genre film, but I do think that more needed to be done to make us feel the fear that these women feel, to make us feel how intense the situation is. Like having Tessa Thompson walk around looking nervous and afraid and be nervous when she's getting a tea downtown in the city that she lives. Like it wasn't enough for me. And yeah, when I say that way, that does sound like a lot. But like, it's a big deal if Claire is found out to be passing, especially by a racist husband. Like that is horrible. He could kill her if he wants. There's this huge stake, and I think we needed to see a bit more tension, like a bit more of the tension between the races, a bit more of the fear of people. Even if you're not seeing this tension day to day on the street, like the fear that a normal person would be living with, if not Claire. And at the same time, there is a huge amount of economic fear with Irene. Like if Brian leaves her, even if she has an education, she is still a single Black mom with 2 young kids. Like she's still in a difficult position to have to support herself and support her kids. Like it's not easy. And I think both of their situations are much more serious. And Claire doesn't take it seriously, but like Irene clings so much to her family life and so much of the security that she has found. And I think it was worth exploring. It was worth bringing us into the world. I'm not saying we had to explore these 2 things explicitly, but I think it was worth. I don't think you could have taken the novel and just translated it the way it looks in the novel onto the screen. I think more needed to be done to set us in that time period and to get us thinking about what it is like. Like, why are these women acting this way? Why are they scared? It's funny because I'm always someone who's like, I don't need more exposition, like less is more, get to the point. But the truth is, I think more needed to be done. And I'll fully commit and admit that it was probably a budget thing. Like I'm sure there was a lot that Hall wanted to do and could have done and probably was very limited by the budget. So this is no this is no critique on her directing or her decisions. Like I just think that this film could have had so much richness to it. I also think that Hall missed the point to really showcase the Harlem Renaissance. Like it is such a vibrant time. It was marked by a lot of things. We think mostly of music and literature, but fashion as well. And we get shots of them at the Black Welfare League dance. And I think those shots could have been more intentional. I wish we had gotten a bit more of the music, even if it was like a clip of music, but like a song from the time. I would have loved to see like 1 or 2 outfits of that time and really gotten to see it because the fashion was a part of the Harlem Renaissance. And I just don't think the culture was, it was cool because you're obviously within this affluent Black community. Like that aspect is cool. But again, I wish I could have seen that community more because it just wasn't enough for me. And it was such a perfect opportunity to get more and to show it even just a little bit. I talked a lot about the romantic or potential romance between the 2 characters. And, Ruth Negga to me nailed it. Like she did nail that longing and also that ambiguous and open to interpretation longing. But I think it could have been, I don't want to say it was creepier. Maybe I do want this to be a genre film, but I don't. Like I don't want it to be a genre film, but like when we're panning and we first see Claire, like it just happens too fast. And I think the way that Ruth Negga is looking, or Claire is looking at Irene is like creepy. And it's meant to be creepy because Irene is just a white, trying to be a white person in a white place. So she's creeped out by this white woman staring at her. And I just think, some of these moments could have been played up for, I don't want to say the horror, because I don't mean horror in a genre, but I mean like personal horror that it is for this person. And when I was reading this book, I mentioned things like Wicker Park and Ingrid Goes West and the movie The Roommate. But to be honest, when I was reading the book, more than anything, it made me think of A Separate Piece. And in A Separate Piece, you have this dynamic between 2 best friends and, Phineas loves Jean and Jean loves Phineas. But to some extent, Jean is very annoyed at Phineas and by how free-spirited and easygoing and unencumbered he is and how popular he is. And it kind of pushes Jean to just act impulsively and do something bad. And it reminded me a lot of that because the thing that seems to annoy Irene is Claire's unencumberdness. Like it's the fact that she has been through so much, but she's just so unaffected by it. And even when her life is falling apart in ruins, and the worst thing that could have happened, which is her husband finds out she's Black, even when it's all happening, it doesn't bother Claire. And it is that forces Claire to rush at her and potentially knock her out a window. And, in a separate piece, what happens in the novel, we get like half the novel, if not more, to sit with Jean and what he did and to contend with it and to find peace with it. And in this book, we get a page and a half, like it ends. And it's so abrupt and we don't get to explore it a lot. And yet it's so open for interpretation. And there's so much richness to it. And I think some of that was lost. Like, we don't see it enough. And instead, I think we just got too many scenes of Claire's anxiety when really we didn't get enough of the things that were driving Claire to anxiety. So I like the film. I don't know if I recommend it, to be honest. I think the book is incredible. It's such a short read. It's 120 pages. And to be honest, like, it's beautiful writing. You can read it very quickly. Like, I've never read Nella Larsen's work. She wrote this and she wrote another novel the year before. I've never read Quicksand. I never read any of her work and I absolutely love it. I can see why it was, an instant hit. After this book, she became the first woman to win the Guggenheim Fellowship, but she never wrote again. She traveled abroad for a while. She never published again. She eventually divorced her husband, completely left Harlem, moved to the Lower East Side, and just worked as a nurse the rest of her life. So she really disappeared from social society. Not immediately after this book. She had a bit of a plagiarism scandal, but she disappeared from society. So we really only have this book and her other book, Quicksand. But they're both so emblematic, or this is so emblematic of the Harlem Renaissance of the time period and so well written. So I do recommend the book. And that's all I have for you today. I really hope you enjoyed this analysis. I am very new to this topic. I still don't feel like I know enough about Passing or Nella Larsen or the Harlem Renaissance. So if you're someone who knows, like, please drop in the chat. Like, tell us what you know, educate us. I think we all would love to learn more. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. I publish episodes weekly, so I will see you again soon. Bye.